First, he wrote up yesterday, and Biden gave what probably was the longest press conference so far of his presidency. A couple hours he was up there, and I don't know if he said much of anything, but you did write up the important stuff that he said about this Russia Ukraine situation, which is continuing to evolve. I believe there's actually going to be talks tomorrow. That'll be Friday the 21st between Blinken and Lavrov. That's the Russian foreign minister in Vienna. But Biden made some interesting statements. So tell us what happened.
Yeah, so in that, I think it was an hour and a half at least, his press conference. It was a total mess. It was kind of hard to follow. He's just kind of rambling, but he did the one thing he said that I thought was, worth writing up was that he said that there's room to work with Russia on, Putin's kind of his key demands. And the first one is that Ukraine won't ever join NATO. And then the other one is that the U.S. won't deploy missiles or other strategic weapons to Ukraine that could target Russia. On the NATO thing, Biden repeated the line that, like, oh, it's up to, I don't even know how he said it. It was such a jumbled mess. But basically, what NATO and other U.S. officials have been saying, like, it's up to Ukraine to decide what they do. It's up to us. It's not up to a third country. And he said that, but then he also said that the likelihood of Ukraine joining NATO in the near term is unlikely. And he said, they have corruption, and I don't know if all NATO members would vote to join them. And it's always funny to hear Biden talk about Ukraine's corruption because when he was vice president and the U.S. orchestrated a coup in the country, helped overthrow the government, and his son Hunter, which everybody knows this part, got a really high-paying job on the board of a Ukrainian natural gas company. I think he was like 50 grand a month, no experience. So it's always just funny to hear him say that. But, I think that is kind of something. And it was interesting. It was actually David Sanger from the New York Times I was asking him the question, who was, he's just awful Sanger. But he managed to get an actual answer out of Biden. And so back in December, I think it was the Associated Press reported, citing some officials. They said that the Biden administration has made clear to Ukraine that there's no NATO membership for at least a decade. Now, is that kind of an informal promise enough for Russia? They seem to be really set on these. They want written guarantees that Ukraine won't ever join NATO. But we know that the U.S. has broken a similar promise at the end of the Cold War. They promised that NATO wouldn't expand eastward, and look what has happened. But maybe they could settle for a written thing, at least, in 10 years. Ukraine won't join NATO in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Or something like that. We'll see. And then the other concern, the deploying missiles and stuff. I forget his exact quote, but I think he said, we can work something out on that. And he said a word I didn't even understand what it was. That's why this is kind of tough to write yesterday. But he said something about as long as Putin agrees with deploying missiles in Russia, but near borders with European countries. So, of course, he had to qualify it with that, but. I think that is kind of saying something. And as you could see from the press conference, the media is like out for blood. They're out for Russian blood right now. And it seems like there's all this hysteria. Putin's going to invade. Even a lot of people on our side are saying, yeah, well, he has no other choice because the U.S. isn't giving him an inch or anything. But I don't see it that way. I think Putin has nothing to gain from really invading Ukraine and trying to take out the government. That's kind of insane. But the one thing that could happen is, in the eastern Donbass region there, Luhansk and Luhansk, the separatist breakaway regions, some fighting could flare up there. And the U.S. has set it up that if anything flares up, even if it's Ukraine being the aggressor, they have said that Russia's planning a false flag there. And that was just a nonsense story. I'm sure you've talked about it.
Yeah.
That was just placed in the media and then repeated by the White House and Pentagon. So if something happens there, if there's a flare up, it's going to be blamed on Russia no matter what. And then that could be the thing that the U.S. media and the establishment says, oh, see, we knew he was going to invade, and then they do sanctions or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's my concern, because that's a vulnerable area where like anybody can kind of mess around. And there's a lot of factions, I think, that within the U.S. government that some want an escalation, some don't, and Biden's just not in control enough to really rein everybody in and keep them on the same page. So, but Blinken is talking to Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, tomorrow, like you said, on these guarantees. So hopefully, it's good that they're still talking. That's the good sign here.
Yeah, so and I even do it on the show, and I think it is somewhat true that sometimes Biden just doesn't seem to maybe cognitively have it. However, on Ukraine policy, as you just explained, he laid this out better than I've seen anybody do in the mainstream, talking about U.S. officials and in the media in the past year. There are major problems with Ukraine joining NATO. It's not that France and Germany actually want that, right? Like the U.S. would have to get those two states to go along if it wanted to do it. And they really might not want to. Germany has said that they want like the Nord Stream 2 stuff left out of that. So that realization is important. The corruption issue within Ukraine is important to recognize, and the fact that it's only Joe Biden doing it is very interesting. But I guess, and I asked this to Scott, the Horton, before everybody last time he was on the show, and I guess my concern is this: the Biden seems to want to give an informal kind of promise to Putin, which seems to make sense. Like, I don't think it really made sense for Ukraine to join NATO in the next 10 years and everything like that. But he has a lot of difficult people in his administration: Victoria Nuland, Jade Sullivan, Antony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, all these people who are involved in the actual crafting and, talks with Russia on the policy level. I think kind of view Ukraine as a playground almost, where they could, go in, manipulate things, and try to orchestrate and engineer a situation where they think that they could really come out ahead, whatever the hell that means. I think, to me and you, that sounds absolutely insane, right? Like, what could they possibly do to set up Ukraine in a way where you're not drastically empowering the ultra nationalists, the super like kind of neo-Nazi Stefan Bandera worshipping types in Ukraine, and to not pick a fight with Russia, and to somehow give Ukraine the power to turn back a Russian invasion. I mean, it all seems crazy and insane, but at the same time, it kind of seems like, that's what they've been working on. We find out that they have this covert program for the past 7 years now, where they're training Ukrainian insurgents in the United States, and then they're giving 200 million and more weapons. Blinken just went to Kiev. They're saying, oh my God, Ukraine could invade every day, but let me go ahead and send the Secretary of State to the capital of that country. That sounds likely to me, Dave. But Blinken's there, and he pledges another $200 million in aid. They approve Estonia, Latvia, and with Lithuania to transfer more weapons to Ukraine. The UK is sending anti-tank missiles. Canada is sending special operation advisors. And so it really seems like, as Ted Galen Carpenter was writing about in November, that there are elements in the United States that are really trying to turn Ukraine into at least a de facto NATO member. And so maybe without an explicit pledge in writing from the US, it does come up short for Russia. And what kind of situation does that leave us in?
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to think that besides the membership, Russia they definitely want some guarantees on all the weapons, assistance, the training. I mean, there's U.S. Special Forces in Ukraine training Ukrainian troops. And then, like you said, the CIA has been training them inside the U.S. for a while now. And yeah, and, NATO holds like big military exercises in Ukraine. And that is another aspect of the Russian security proposals, is they want some kind of deal on like the deployment of each other's military, like near their border or in areas that they view as like a threat. Of course, NATO in the Black Sea and Ukraine, that's obviously, Russia will view that as a threat. And you see the U.S. kind of some hypocrisy recently. They said, because Russia just sent some troops to Belarus to do some exercises, they're saying, oh, this could just be a cover for an invasion of Ukraine. It's like, well, then all the U.S. and NATO exercises in countries that border Russia, by that logic, or the bombers that fly 12 miles off the coast of Russia, they're cover for an invasion of Russia. So, um, yeah, and there are a lot of factors in the Biden administration that want to at least keep the status quo, want to keep the tensions up. There's tons of interest in sending them more weapons. So you said they authorized another 200 million. I'm kind of losing track now because Biden said at the press conference he sent them 600 million so far during his term. And so I'm not sure what the total was for 2021. This year, the Pentagon signed off on, not the Pentagon, the National Defense Authorization Act authorizes 300 million for Ukraine. And then some senators introduced a bill that would authorize another 500 million if Biden determined that Russia was being aggressive towards Ukraine. So it does seem like it would be really tough to slow down all this momentum. And you mentioned Germany. Germany's kind of an interesting factor here because the new government, they're not getting on board with sending Ukraine weapons. I think they do want this pipeline up and running. So yeah, I just don't see, the Biden administration really committing to like limiting their cooperation with Ukraine. But who knows what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's always the interesting thing. We really don't get to see very much of it. Exactly, what's all happening in the Biden administration too, and how much. I mean, if Biden isn't paying that much attention to what's happening with Russia because he's all worried about COVID and hearing briefings on that all day long, and the filibuster and voting rights, and everybody picking on Kamala Harris or whatever the hell else everybody thinks is an important issue, then how much does, say, Jade Sullivan, who just had a call with probably Michael McFaul, the rest of the Hods, influencing this without Biden really getting to set the tone and everything like that, and what kind of position could he find himself in then?